When Arthur chose a 22-year-old intern over our 8-year marriage, I was devastated. But when I walked down the aisle 2 years later to marry her ex-boyfriend Marcel and saw Arthur's face in the crowd pale with shock at the wedding invitation I'd personally delivered, I knew my revenge was complete. The crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Roosevelt Hotel cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as I stood frozen, watching my husband of 8 years pack his belongings into a leather suitcase. The same suitcase we'd used for our honeymoon in Tuscany, now being filled with his designer suits and expensive cologne. Everything that would help him start his new life with Camilla. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You don't have to do this tonight, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of zippers and drawers slamming shut. We can talk about this tomorrow when we're both calmer. Arthur didn't look up from folding his Harvard Business School tie, the one I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. Amelia, we've talked enough. I've made my decision. The casual way he said my name, like I was a colleague he was dismissing from a meeting, sent ice through my veins. This was the same man who used to whisper my name like a prayer during our Sunday morning coffee rituals, who would trace the letters EMILIA on my back when he thought I was sleeping. 8 years, Arthur. 8 years of building a life together, and you're throwing it away for a girl who was probably in high school when we got married. He finally stopped packing and turned to face me, his steel gray eyes holding none of the warmth I'd fallen in love with during our graduate program at Columbia. Camilla makes me feel alive again. She's passionate, spontaneous, everything we used to be before we got trapped in this routine. The word routine hit me like a physical blow. Our life wasn't routine, it was stable, comfortable, successful. We owned a brownstone in the Upper East Side worth $3 million. I was a senior marketing director at Morrison & Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious advertising agencies. Arthur had built his architectural consulting firm from nothing into a company that designed skyscrapers across 3 continents. Routine, I laughed bitterly, gesturing around our master bedroom with its custom Italian furniture and original Monet hanging above the fireplace. You mean the routine of building an empire together? The routine of supporting each other through every success and failure? You don't understand, Arthur said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used with difficult clients. Camilla and I have something special. She sees me for who I really am, not just the successful businessman everyone expects me to be. I wanted to scream that I'd seen him at his worst, when his father died and he couldn't get out of bed for a week, when his first business venture failed and he cried in my arms about feeling like a disappointment. I'd held his head while he was sick with food poisoning on our anniversary trip to Paris. I'd celebrated every promotion, every award, every moment of triumph by his side. But Camilla, a 22-year-old architectural intern with platinum blonde hair and legs that went on for miles, she saw the real him after 3 months of afternoon meetings that had supposedly been about mentoring junior staff. When did it start? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. When did you decide that our marriage meant nothing? Arthur had the decency to look uncomfortable for a moment. It wasn't planned, Amelia. It just happened. Sometimes people grow apart. People don't grow apart, Arthur. People make choices. You chose to have coffee with her after work. You chose to take her to that conference in Chicago. You chose to answer her calls at midnight and tell me it was work emergencies. The truth was, I'd known something was wrong for months. Arthur had started working late more frequently, had become secretive about his phone, had stopped initiating our usual weekend plans. When I'd suggested couples therapy, he'd dismissed it as unnecessary drama. When I'd planned a surprise weekend getaway for our anniversary, he'd claimed he was too busy with the Peterson project, the same project Camilla was supposedly assisting with. The final confirmation had come 3 days ago when I'd stopped by his office to bring him lunch, only to find his secretary stammering excuses about why Arthur wasn't available, while I could clearly hear a young woman's laughter coming from behind his closed door. That evening, I'd checked our credit card statements and found charges for restaurants I'd never been to, jewelry purchases I'd never received, and a hotel room booked during the Chicago conference, a conference I'd later learned had been canceled due to weather. I've already signed a lease on an apartment downtown, Arthur continued, zipping his suitcase closed with an air of finality. Camilla and I are going to travel for a while, maybe spend a few months in Europe before we settle down. With my money, I said quietly, With the money I invested in your business when you were struggling to pay rent on that tiny office in Brooklyn. Our lawyers will sort out the financial details, he replied dismissively, as if our 8-year partnership was just a business transaction to be dissolved. I watched him gather the last of his personal items, his expensive watch collection, the signed baseball from Derek Jeter that I'd hunted down for his 30th birthday, the framed photo of his parents that I'd restored after it was damaged in a flood. Each item felt like another piece of our shared history being erased. "Do you love her?" I asked as he headed toward the bedroom door. Arthur paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, uncertain, vulnerable, human. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "Yes," he said simply, "I love her in a way I never loved you." Those words would replay in my mind for months afterward, each repetition like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. Not just that he loved her, but that he'd never really loved me. Not the way I'd loved him, not the way I'd believed he loved me. I heard the front door close with a soft click that seemed to echo through our empty brownstone. 8 years of marriage, reduced to the sound of a door closing. I sank onto our king-sized bed, still unmade from the morning when everything had been normal, when I'd kissed him goodbye and told him I loved him, when I'd still believed that love was enough. The silence in the house was deafening. No more of Arthur's late-night phone calls with international clients, no more jazz music playing from his home office, no more sound of his key in the lock, signaling the end of another day we'd navigated together. I was 32 years old, successful, financially stable, and completely utterly alone. Outside our bedroom window, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, millions of people living their lives while mine had just imploded. Somewhere across the city, Arthur was probably helping Camilla unpack in their new apartment, telling her how brave he'd been to finally leave his marriage, how free he felt now that he could be his authentic self. I had no idea that this moment, sitting alone on my marriage bed, feeling like my world had ended, would actually be the beginning of the most satisfying chapter of my life. I met Arthur during the first week of Columbia University's joint MBA architecture graduate program, back when I still believed that love stories happened the way they did in movies. It was September 2014, and I was 24 years old with an undergraduate degree in marketing from NYU and dreams of revolutionizing the advertising industry. The program was designed for students pursuing dual expertise, future architects who understood business, and future business leaders who understood design. Only 30 students were accepted each year, making it one of the most competitive programs on the East Coast. Arthur stood out immediately, not just because he was devastatingly handsome with his dark hair and those piercing gray eyes, but because he carried himself with a confidence that seemed almost magnetic. While the rest of us nervously introduced ourselves during orientation, Arthur spoke about his undergraduate thesis on sustainable urban development like he was already running the firm he planned to build. "I want to design buildings that don't just house people, but transform communities," he'd said during our first group project discussion. Architecture should be about creating legacy, not just filling space. I was impressed by his vision, but what drew me to him was the moment I caught him after class, frantically searching through his backpack with growing panic. "Everything okay?" I'd asked, watching him dump the contents of his bag onto a bench in the courtyard. "I can't find my lucky pen," he admitted sheepishly. "I know it sounds stupid, but it was my grandfather's. He used it to design his first building back in the 1960s. The confident facade had cracked just enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath. I helped him search through his scattered notebooks and textbooks until we found the vintage silver fountain pen wedged between the pages of his design theory textbook. "Thank you," he'd said, his relief genuine. "I would have failed the midterm without this." "It's just a pen," I teased gently. "It's not just a pen," he corrected, carefully placing it in his shirt pocket. "It's a reminder that great things start with simple tools and big dreams." That conversation led to coffee, which led to study sessions, which led to long walks through Central Park where Arthur would point out architectural details I'd never noticed, the way the Plaza Hotel's facade caught the evening light, how the Bethesda fountain's design created perfect acoustic resonance. Our first real date was at a tiny Italian restaurant in Little Italy, where Arthur sketched building designs on napkins while I told him about my plans to start my own advertising agency someday. We talked until the restaurant closed around us, the conversation flowing as naturally as breathing. "You see possibilities where other people see problems," Arthur had observed, studying a napkin where I'd drawn my ideas for a marketing campaign targeting sustainable architecture firms. That's going to make you dangerous in the best possible way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By Thanksgiving break, we were inseparable. Arthur came home with me to meet my parents in their modest house in New Jersey, charming my mother with his genuine interest in her garden design and impressing my father by asking thoughtful questions about his work as a civil engineer. "He's different from the boys you usually date," my mother had whispered while we were preparing dinner. "He looks at you like you're the most interesting person in the room." She was right. Arthur had a way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the world when he focused those gray eyes on me. He remembered everything: how I liked my coffee, that I was allergic to shellfish, that I got nervous before presentations and needed exactly 7 minutes of complete silence to center myself. Our second year of graduate school was when we started talking seriously about the future. Arthur had been accepted into a prestigious internship with Foster Partners in London, while I'd received an offer from a boutique advertising agency in Manhattan. "We'll make it work," Arthur had said, holding me close in his tiny studio apartment. "1 year apart, and then we'll be back in the same city building our empire." The long-distance relationship was harder than either of us had anticipated, but it also proved how solid our foundation was. Arthur would call me every morning from London, calculating the time difference so he could wish me good luck before important client presentations. I would stay up late to video chat with him over dinner, sharing the details of my day while he showed me sketches of the buildings he was helping design. When he returned to New York in June 2017, Arthur had changed. The year in London had given him a sophistication and worldliness that made him even more attractive. He'd learned to appreciate fine wine, could recommend the best restaurants in any neighborhood, and had developed connections with some of the most influential architects in the world. "I missed you every single day," he'd said when he picked me up from my apartment in a black BMW he'd somehow acquired during his absence. "But being apart made me realize how rare what we have is." He proposed that Christmas, during a snowstorm that had blanketed Central Park in pristine white. We'd been walking the same path where he used to point out architectural details during our graduate school dates, when he suddenly stopped near the Bow Bridge and dropped to one knee. "Amelia Rodriguez," he'd said, his voice steady despite the snow falling around us, "you've been my partner in everything that matters. Will you marry me and make it official?" The ring was perfect. A classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught the light from the park's vintage lampposts. But what made the moment perfect wasn't the ring or the romantic setting. It was the certainty in Arthur's eyes, the way he'd planned the proposal around a location that held meaning for our relationship rather than just choosing someplace impressive. Our wedding in June 2018 was everything we'd dreamed of: elegant but not ostentatious, held at the New York Botanical Garden with 150 of our closest friends and family members. Arthur had insisted on writing his own vows, and I still remembered how his voice had broken slightly when he promised to build a life with you that's more beautiful than any structure I could ever design. For 4 years, that promise held true. We bought our brownstone. I was promoted to senior director at Morrison & Associates, and Arthur's firm, Thompson Design Collective, began winning awards and high-profile clients. We traveled together, hosted dinner parties, supported each other's careers, and talked about starting a family once we'd established ourselves professionally. I thought we were building something permanent, something that would last. I had no idea that Arthur was already planning the demolition. The first 3 years of our marriage felt like living inside a perfectly curated Instagram feed, except it was real. Arthur and I had developed rhythms and traditions that made our brownstone feel like the center of the universe, at least our universe. Every Sunday morning, Arthur would wake up early to buy fresh bagels from Russ and Daughters while I prepared our elaborate coffee setup. He'd return with the Sunday Times tucked under his arm and whatever seasonal pastries had caught his eye, and we'd spend hours in our sun-drenched kitchen, reading different sections aloud to each other and planning the week ahead. "Listen to this," Arthur would say, adjusting his reading glasses as he found an article about sustainable architecture or urban planning. He'd read me entire pieces about green building initiatives while I painted my nails or answered emails, his voice becoming animated whenever he encountered an idea that excited him. Those Sunday mornings were sacred, no matter how busy our careers became, no matter what social obligations filled our calendar, we protected that time like it was oxygen. The brownstone itself became our joint masterpiece, Arthur handled the structural renovations with the precision of someone who understood load-bearing walls and optimal light flow, while I managed the interior design with an eye for color and texture that impressed even his most sophisticated clients. "You should have been an interior designer," Arthur would joke when friends complimented our living space. "The way you put together that gallery wall in the hallway is pure genius." He wasn't just being polite. I'd spent weeks arranging and rearranging a collection of vintage photographs, modern art prints, and architectural drawings to create something that told the story of our relationship. Arthur had framed his grandfather's original building sketches alongside photos from our travels, creating a visual narrative that guests always stopped to study. Our dinner parties became legendary among our circle of friends. Arthur would design elaborate menus inspired by our latest travels, French cuisine after our anniversary trip to Provence, authentic Italian dishes after a client meeting in Milan, Japanese-inspired meals after his firm won a contract designing a cultural center in Tokyo. I handled the guest lists and table settings with the same strategic thinking I applied to marketing campaigns. Karen, Arthur's business partner's wife, always sat next to my colleague Howard from Morrison & Associates because they both loved discussing art history. Elaine, my college roommate who worked as a museum curator, would be placed across from whoever Arthur's newest fascinating client happened to be. "You orchestrate these evenings like a conductor," Arthur would whisper to me during dessert, watching our guests engaged in animated conversations around our restored mahogany dining table. "Everyone leaves here feeling like they've made new connections." Those parties weren't just social events, they were investments in our shared future. Arthur would land new clients after architects met potential collaborators at our table. I'd develop business relationships that led to major advertising contracts. We were building more than a marriage. We were creating a power couple dynamic that opened doors neither of us could have accessed alone. Arthur's business grew exponentially during those years, partly because of his talent, but also because of how we presented ourselves as a team. I would attend his client presentations, not as decoration, but as a strategic partner who understood how to market architectural concepts to hesitant investors. "Amelia has a gift for translating design vision into language that non-architects understand," Arthur would tell potential clients during our carefully choreographed meetings. "She's the reason our projects get approved by boards who usually think modern means expensive and risky." It wasn't flattery, it was true. I'd developed a specialty in helping Arthur's firm secure contracts by creating presentation materials that showed potential clients exactly how a new building would impact their bottom line, their community reputation, and their long-term property values. When Thompson Design Collective won the contract to design the new headquarters for a major tech company in 2020, Arthur insisted that I be listed as a consulting partner in the press release. "This success belongs to both of us," he'd said, pulling me close as we read the announcement in Architectural Digest. "You're not just my wife, Amelia. You're my secret weapon." That same year, Morrison & Associates promoted me to senior director, making me the youngest person ever to hold that position at the firm. Arthur threw a surprise party at our house to celebrate, inviting everyone from my college professors to my current colleagues. "To Amelia," he'd toasted, raising a glass of champagne in our living room packed with people who mattered to me, who proves every day that brilliance and beauty aren't mutually exclusive. We started talking seriously about children around our 4th anniversary. Not in the vague someday way of our dating years, but with concrete timelines and practical considerations. "I want our kids to grow up in this house," Arthur would say, standing in what we designated as the future nursery. "I want them to have Sunday morning bagels and dinner parties where they learn to talk to adults about interesting things." He'd already started sketching ideas for converting the 3rd floor into a playroom, complete with built-in bookshelves and a reading nook positioned to catch the afternoon light. I'd begun researching the best pediatricians in our neighborhood and calculating how maternity leave would affect my career trajectory. 2 years, we'd decided together. 2 more years to solidify our careers, and then we'll start trying. Arthur even began turning down travel-heavy projects, prioritizing local contracts that wouldn't require him to spend weeks away from home. "I want to be present for everything," he'd told me one evening as we planned our 5th anniversary trip. "I don't want to be the father who misses school plays because he's in Dubai looking at construction sites." The future felt so certain, so carefully planned and beautifully designed. We had blueprints for everything: the business expansion, the family planning, even the renovations we'd do once children made our current setup impractical. What I didn't realize was that while I was planning our future, Arthur was already questioning whether he wanted to be part of it. The foundation I thought we'd built together was apparently less solid than I'd believed. Our 5th wedding anniversary in June 2023 was supposed to be a celebration of everything we'd accomplished together. Arthur had just been featured on the cover of Architectural Review magazine as one of 30 Under 35, the future of American design, while I'd successfully launched Morrison & Associates' first sustainability-focused campaign that had already attracted 3 major clients seeking environmentally conscious marketing strategies. "We're unstoppable," Arthur had said that morning, bringing me coffee in bed along with both magazines that featured our respective achievements. "Look at what we've built, Em." He only called me Em during our most intimate moments, and hearing that nickname while surrounded by tangible proof of our success felt like confirmation that we were living our best possible life. The anniversary party was Arthur's idea. "Let's do something bigger than our usual dinner parties," he'd suggested 6 weeks earlier. 5 years deserves a real celebration. We rented the rooftop terrace at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the same venue where we'd attended a charity gala during our 2nd year of marriage and had whispered to each other about hosting our own event there someday. Arthur handled the catering arrangements with his usual attention to detail, while I managed the guest list and coordinating with vendors. 85 people, I'd told Arthur as we finalized the RSVPs, including your parents flying in from Chicago and my college friends coming from Boston. "Perfect," he'd replied, reviewing the seating chart I'd created. "I want everyone who matters to us to see how far we've come." The evening of the party was flawless. Manhattan stretched out below us in the golden hour light, the city skyline providing a backdrop that seemed designed specifically for our celebration. Arthur had chosen a color scheme of deep navy and gold that complemented the museum's architecture, while I'd arranged for string quartet music that was sophisticated without being stuffy. Arthur looked impossibly handsome in his custom navy suit, the one he'd had tailored in London during a recent business trip. I wore a gold silk dress that he'd helped me select, and my grandmother's pearl earrings that had been my something borrowed during our wedding. "You look like a goddess," Arthur whispered as guests began arriving, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. "I'm the luckiest man in New York." The guest list represented our entire world: Arthur's business partners and their spouses, my colleagues from Morrison & Associates, friends from graduate school who'd traveled from across the country, family members who'd watched our relationship develop from awkward first dates to this polished partnership. My parents had flown in from New Jersey, my father clearly proud to be mingling with Arthur's high-profile clients. Arthur's mother Karen kept introducing me to distant relatives as the brilliant daughter-in-law who's just as successful as our Arthur, while his father spent the evening discussing sustainable building materials with anyone who would listen. The toasts began around sunset, when the Manhattan skyline transformed into a glittering backdrop that made everyone reach for their phones to capture the moment. Arthur's business partner John spoke first, recounting the early days of Thompson Design Collective when they'd worked out of a shared workspace in Brooklyn and survived on coffee and determination. "Arthur always said he wanted to build something permanent," John concluded, raising his glass toward us. "Tonight, looking at what he and Amelia have created together, I think it's safe to say he's succeeded beyond his wildest dreams." My best friend Elaine followed with stories from our college years, painting a picture of my evolution from an ambitious but uncertain 20-year-old to the confident woman standing before our guests. Amelia used to practice her presentation skills by giving speeches to our dorm room mirror, she revealed, earning laughter from the crowd. Now she's revolutionizing how companies think about sustainable marketing. But more importantly, she found a partner who appreciates her brilliance. Then Arthur stood up, and the entire terrace fell silent. He had a gift for commanding attention without demanding it, and when he spoke, people listened. 5 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the rooftop, "I married the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. Tonight, I'm still married to the most remarkable woman I've ever met. But now the rest of the world has figured out what I knew all along." He turned to face me directly, his gray eyes reflecting the city lights behind us. "Amelia doesn't just support my dreams, she makes them bigger and better than I ever imagined they could be. She doesn't just love me, she challenges me to be worthy of that love every single day." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Arthur reached for my hand. To 5 years of building something beautiful together, and to the next 50 years of whatever comes next. As our guests raised their glasses, Arthur leaned down to kiss me, and for a moment the sounds of the city and the party faded away. This was our moment, successful, celebrated, surrounded by everyone who mattered to us. "I love you, Mrs. Thompson," Arthur murmured against my ear as applause surrounded us. "I love you too," I whispered back, meaning it completely. The party continued for another 3 hours. Guests mingled on the terrace, the string quartet played requests, and Arthur and I moved through the crowd together, accepting congratulations and basking in the warmth of being celebrated by our community. Around midnight, as the last guests were saying their goodbyes, Arthur pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the terrace. "This was perfect," he said, looking out over the city that had given us everything. "You were perfect. Tonight was exactly what I wanted." I leaned against his chest, feeling utterly content. "Here's to the next 5 years being even better." "Even better," Arthur agreed, his arms tightening around me. Standing there in my husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of our success and the memory of an evening where everything had gone exactly right, I felt invincible. We were young, successful, deeply in love, and just getting started. I had no idea that this perfect moment was actually the peak before the fall, or that Arthur's words about exactly what I wanted had an expiration date I couldn't see coming. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared 3 weeks after our anniversary party. Though I didn't recognize it as a warning at the time, Arthur came home from work carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. Excitement mixed with something that looked almost guilty. "We need to celebrate," he announced, setting the bottle on our kitchen counter with more force than necessary. Thompson Design Collective just landed the Morrison Tower project. I knew about Morrison Tower, a 40-story luxury residential building that would reshape the downtown skyline. It was the kind of project that could define an architect's career, the sort of contract that transformed small firms into major players. "Arthur, that's incredible." I threw my arms around him, genuinely thrilled. "This is everything you've worked for." "There's more," he said, his hands resting on my waist but his eyes not quite meeting mine. "The client specifically requested me because of the sustainability angle you helped develop for our presentation materials. They want the building to be a showcase for environmentally conscious luxury." "That's amazing. We should call your parents and John." "Actually," Arthur interrupted, stepping back slightly, "there's a complication. The project timeline is incredibly aggressive, 18 months from design to completion, which means I'll be working closely with a small team of specialists." Something in his tone made me pause. "What kind of specialists?" "Environmental consultants, mostly. The client wants to achieve LEED Platinum certification, so we're bringing in experts in sustainable materials and energy-efficient systems." Arthur moved to the wine fridge, his back to me as he spoke. "One of them is this brilliant young architect who specializes in green building technologies. Camilla Walsh. She just finished her master's at MIT. The name hit me like a small electric shock, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way Arthur said it, carefully, like he was testing how it sounded aloud. "Will she be working directly with you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Some collaboration, yes. She'll be on site during the initial phases to ensure the environmental systems integrate properly with the structural design." Arthur finally turned around, his expression bright and professionally enthusiastic. "It's exactly the kind of cutting-edge project I've always wanted to lead." Over the next few weeks, Arthur's work schedule shifted dramatically. The man who had always been home by 7 began staying at the office until 9 or 10, claiming the Morrison Tower project required extensive evening meetings with various consultants and city planning officials. "I'm sorry, Em," he'd say when I texted asking about dinner plans. "Camilla found some issues with the HVAC integration that we need to resolve tonight. The environmental consultant wants to review the materials specifications one more time before we submit to the Planning Commission. We're having a working dinner to finalize the sustainability metrics. Always Camilla. Always urgent. Always requiring Arthur's immediate and extended attention." I began eating dinner alone most nights, reheating portions of meals I'd optimistically prepared for 2. The Sunday morning bagel tradition continued, but Arthur seemed distracted during our conversations, frequently checking his phone and apologizing for quick work messages. "Is everything okay with the project?" I asked one Sunday in late July, watching him scroll through what appeared to be a lengthy text conversation. "You seem stressed." "It's just complicated," Arthur replied without looking up. "Integrating sustainable systems into luxury specifications requires constant problem-solving. Camilla and I are basically learning as we go." Camilla and I, the phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. I started paying closer attention to Arthur's habits. His gym schedule became erratic. Sometimes he'd leave early for pre-work meetings. Other times he'd go late, claiming he needed to clear his head after difficult days. His phone, which had always been casually accessible, suddenly required passwords and face-down placement during our conversations. "Since when do you password protect your phone?" I asked one evening when Arthur's phone buzzed repeatedly during dinner and he ignored it completely. "Client confidentiality," he explained smoothly. "The Morrison Tower project involves some proprietary technologies that require extra security measures." The explanation was reasonable, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed. In August, Arthur began traveling more frequently for site visits and consultant meetings. A weekend trip to Boston to tour sustainable buildings with the environmental team. 3 days in Portland examining green building materials with specialists from the West Coast. An overnight trip to Philadelphia to meet with renewable energy consultants. "I could come with you," I suggested when he mentioned the Philadelphia trip. "We could make a weekend of it, visit some of those restaurants you're always reading about." "It's going to be all work," Arthur said quickly. "Literally 12-hour days looking at solar panel installations and geothermal systems. You'd be bored out of your mind." When he returned from these trips, Arthur seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen since our early dating years. His eyes were brighter, his movements more animated, his conversation peppered with references to innovative approaches and breakthrough thinking that apparently characterized his work with the environmental consulting team. "Camilla has this incredible perspective on sustainable design," he'd say over dinner, his fork pausing mid-air as he became absorbed in describing some technical insight she'd shared. "She approaches problems from angles I never would have considered." I began researching Camilla Walsh online, telling myself it was professional curiosity about Arthur's collaborator. The MIT website featured her in an article about rising stars in environmental architecture, complete with a photograph that showed a stunning blonde woman with piercing blue eyes, and the kind of confident smile that suggested she was accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. 26 years old, summa cum laude from her undergraduate program at Yale, published research on sustainable building materials, currently pursuing specialized certification in European green building standards. She was brilliant, accomplished, and young enough to make me feel ancient at 32. The warning signs were all there, scattered across those summer months like breadcrumbs I was too trusting to follow. But I kept telling myself that Arthur was simply passionate about his work, that the Morrison Tower project represented everything he'd worked toward, that his distraction was professional rather than personal. I wanted to believe that our 5-year foundation was strong enough to weather whatever challenges came our way. I had no idea that the foundation was already crumbling, and that Arthur was actively helping to demolish it. The moment that shattered my world came on a Thursday evening in late September. During what should have been an ordinary dinner at home, Arthur had actually arrived on time for once, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and apologizing for his recent absence. "I know I've been distracted lately," he said, unpacking containers of pad thai and green curry on our kitchen island. "The Morrison Tower project is reaching a critical phase, but I want us to have a proper evening together." I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I'd been overthinking the changes in his behavior. Maybe the summer of late nights and mysterious trips was finally ending. We were halfway through dinner when Arthur's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I watched his expression transform from relaxed contentment to something I'd never seen before. Panic mixed with what looked like guilty excitement. "I need to take this," he said, already standing up. "Arthur, we agreed no work calls during dinner. It's urgent," he replied, walking toward his home office. 5 minutes, I promise." But he didn't come back in 5 minutes. I could hear his voice through the closed door, low and intense, occasionally rising with what sounded like emotion rather than professional discussion. After 20 minutes, I gave up on our dinner and started putting the leftovers away. When Arthur finally emerged, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. "Everything okay?" I asked, though his expression clearly indicated it wasn't. Arthur stared at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was the look of someone who had just made a decision they couldn't take back. "Jamelia, we need to talk." Those 5 words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. I'd heard them in movies, read them in novels, but hearing them from my husband's mouth in our own kitchen felt surreal. "About what?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Arthur ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when he was struggling with a difficult design problem. But this wasn't about architecture. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this," he began, his voice hollow. "I never meant for it to happen. You have to believe that. For what to happen? Camilla and I," he paused, swallowing hard, "we've developed feelings for each other." The words hit me like physical blows. Feelings. It started as professional collaboration, but over the summer it became something more, something I wasn't expecting and didn't plan for. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, needing something solid to hold onto as my world tilted off its axis. "How much more?" Arthur's silence was answer enough. "How long?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and mechanical. The feelings started developing in June. We tried to maintain professional boundaries, but he shrugged helplessly. It became impossible to ignore what was happening between us. June. 2 weeks after our perfect anniversary party, while I was still glowing from the toasts and celebrations, Arthur had been falling in love with someone else. "Those business trips," I said flatly, "the late nights, the weekend meetings. Some of them were work," Arthur said quickly, "but yes, some of them were personal." "You've been lying to me for months. I've been trying to figure out what to do," Arthur insisted. "I never wanted to hurt you, Amelia. You're an incredible woman, and you deserve." "Don't." I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve while you're confessing to an affair." Arthur flinched at the word affair, as if calling it what it was made it more real. "What do you want, Arthur?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Do you want to end the affair and work on our marriage? Do you want couples counseling? Do you want I want a divorce?" The words hung between us like a blade. No hesitation, no uncertainty. He'd already decided. "That phone call," I said, understanding dawning. "It was her, wasn't it? She gave you an ultimatum." Arthur's expression confirmed what I already knew. Camilla had called to force his hand, to demand that he choose between his wife and his young lover, and he'd chosen her. "I'm going to pack a bag," Arthur said, already moving toward the stairs. "I'll stay at a hotel tonight and start looking for an apartment this weekend." "That's it?" I called after him. 8 years of marriage, and you're ending it with a bag and a hotel reservation." Arthur stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his back still to me. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I know that's not enough, but it's all I have." I stood alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of our interrupted dinner and the life we'd built together, listening to my husband pack his belongings upstairs. The sound of drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding across closet rods, the zip of his leather suitcase, each noise felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When Arthur finally came downstairs with his bag, he paused at the front door. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours about the details," he said without meeting my eyes. Then he was gone, leaving me standing in the silence of what used to be our home. The silence in the house after Arthur left was deafening. I stood in our foyer for what felt like hours, staring at the door he'd walked through, waiting for him to come back and tell me this was all some horrible mistake. The grandfather clock in our living room ticked steadily, marking time in a world that no longer made sense. My first instinct was to call someone, but who? My parents would be devastated and wouldn't understand how I hadn't seen this coming. My friends would ask questions I couldn't answer. Arthur's family would probably already know, or would find out soon enough when he introduced them to his 26-year-old girlfriend. Instead, I found myself wandering through our brownstone like a ghost haunting her own life. Every room held memories that had been recontextualized by Arthur's confession. The kitchen where we'd planned our future over Sunday morning coffee. The living room where we'd hosted dinner parties that showcased our perfect partnership. The bedroom where we'd talked about children and laughed about growing old together. How long had Arthur been pretending during those conversations? When he'd discussed converting the third floor into a nursery, had he already been imagining a different future with Camilla? When he'd told guests at our anniversary party that I made his dreams bigger and better, had he been planning his exit strategy? I called in sick to work the next morning, something I'd never done unless I was actually hospitalized. My assistant Karen sounded concerned when I told her I had a family emergency and wouldn't be in for a few days. "Is there anything I can help with?" she asked. "Should I reschedule your client meetings?" "Yes, reschedule everything," I managed. "I'll call you when I know more about my schedule." The first person to check on me was Elaine, who showed up at my door Saturday morning with coffee and bagels from Russ and Daughters, our Sunday tradition, delivered 2 days early. "You sounded terrible on the phone," she said, pushing past me into the foyer. "And you look worse." I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and winced. My hair was unwashed, my skin pale and blotchy from crying, my Columbia sweatshirt wrinkled from sleeping in it for 2 nights. Arthur left, I said simply, following Elaine into the kitchen. Left? Like for a business trip. Left. He's having an affair with a 26-year-old architect, and he wants a divorce. Elaine dropped the bag of bagels, her expression shifting from confusion to fury in seconds. That bastard. I knew something was off at your anniversary party. He kept checking his phone during the toasts. You noticed that? I notice everything, Elaine said grimly, pulling me into a fierce hug. How are you holding up? I don't know, I admitted. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all be a nightmare. Elaine made us coffee while I told her everything. The late nights, the mysterious trips, the phone call that had ended my marriage. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. Have you talked to a lawyer? She asked when I finished. Not yet. I keep thinking maybe Arthur will come to his senses. Maybe this is just a midlife crisis or some kind of breakdown. Amelia, Elaine said gently. He packed a bag and moved out. This isn't a temporary lapse in judgment. This is a man who made a choice. The reality of her words hit me like a physical blow. Arthur hadn't left in a moment of passion or confusion. He'd been planning this for months, carefully maintaining his double life while I remained completely oblivious. Sunday arrived without Arthur, breaking our 5-year tradition of bagels and newspapers. I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the silence he'd left behind, trying to imagine how I would fill the hours that used to belong to us. My phone buzzed with a text from Arthur's mother. Arthur told us about the separation. We're heartbroken for both of you. Please know that you'll always be family to us. Separation. That's how Arthur was framing it to his parents, like we were taking a temporary break rather than him abandoning our marriage for another woman. I started to respond, then deleted the message. What was I supposed to say? That their son had been living a lie for months? That he'd chosen a woman closer to their daughter's age than his wife's? Monday brought a call from a lawyer representing Arthur. The conversation was brief and businesslike. Arthur wanted to divide our assets equitably and hoped we could handle the divorce proceedings amicably. My client prefers to avoid contentious litigation, the lawyer explained. He believes you can reach a fair settlement through mediation. How generous of him, I replied, my voice sharp with sarcasm that seemed to catch the lawyer off guard. Mrs. Thompson, I understand this is an emotional time, but my client's proposal is quite reasonable. He's offering you the brownstone and half of the liquid assets, plus spousal support for. I'll need to review everything with my own attorney, I interrupted. Please send all documentation to my lawyer when I've retained one. After hanging up, I realized that Arthur's generous offer was actually calculated to make him look magnanimous while ensuring his new life with Camilla could begin without financial complications. He wasn't just leaving me, he was trying to buy his way out of guilt. The need to understand what had really happened consumed me like a fever. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the gaps in Arthur's story that didn't make sense. A professional collaboration that turned into love didn't explain the careful deception, the months of lies, or the calculated way he'd managed his double life. I started with what I could verify online. Camilla Walsh's LinkedIn profile showed she'd joined the Morrison Tower project in early May, not June as Arthur had claimed. Her Instagram account, which I accessed through a fake profile I created, told a different story than the one Arthur had fed me. Photos from July showed her at expensive restaurants I recognized from our credit card statements, the same restaurants where Arthur claimed to be having working dinners with various consultants. A picture from August showed her wearing a delicate gold bracelet that looked suspiciously similar to one I'd seen charged to Arthur's business account as a client appreciation gift. But the photo that made my blood run cold was from early June, just 2 weeks after our anniversary party. Camilla stood on what was clearly the observation deck of our building, the same view I looked at every morning from our bedroom window. The caption read, "Amazing perspective on the city from this incredible brownstone. Some people really know how to live. Architectural appreciation, New York views." Arthur had brought her to our home. While I was at work building campaigns for clients and believing my marriage was solid, he'd been giving his young lover tours of the life we'd built together. I drove to Arthur's office building on Tuesday afternoon, parking across the street with a clear view of the entrance. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a bad movie, but I needed to see them together. I needed visual confirmation that this wasn't some elaborate breakdown or midlife crisis. They emerged at 5:30 p.m., and seeing them together was worse than anything I'd imagined. Arthur looked younger somehow, more animated than he'd been at home in months. Camilla was even more beautiful in person. Tall, graceful, with the kind of effortless style that came from being naturally stunning rather than trying too hard. But what hurt most was watching how they moved together. Arthur's hand on her lower back as they walked, the way she looked up at him with obvious adoration, how he leaned down to whisper something that made her laugh. It was intimate in a way that spoke of months of familiarity, not a recent professional relationship that had crossed boundaries. This wasn't a man who had reluctantly fallen for a colleague. This was a man who was completely infatuated. I followed them to a wine bar in Soho, staying far enough back to avoid detection but close enough to observe. Through the window, I watched Arthur pull out Camilla's chair, order wine without consulting the menu, touch her hand across the table. Everything he did suggested this was routine, practiced, comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from Arthur, "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." He was lying again. Even after confessing everything, even after leaving me, he couldn't stop the deception. That evening I called Howard from Morrison & Associates, one of the few people who knew both Arthur and me well enough to have noticed things I might have missed. "I need to ask you something," I said without preamble when he answered. "Did you ever notice anything off about Arthur at industry events this summer?" Howard was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking as his wife or as someone who might be having problems?" "Arthur left me," I said simply. "He's been having an affair. Shit, Amelia, I'm so sorry." Howard's voice was genuinely sympathetic. "Actually, yes. There were a couple of times when his behavior seemed odd." "Tell me." "At the Green Building Council mixer in July, he kept checking his phone and stepped out to take calls. When I asked if everything was okay at home, he got defensive and changed the subject." Howard paused, clearly debating whether to continue. "What else?" I pressed. "At the sustainability conference in August, I saw him having dinner with a young blonde woman. When I mentioned it later, he said it was a work colleague, but—" Howard trailed off. "But what?" "They looked like they were on a date, not discussing business. And when she went to the bathroom, Arthur was watching her walk away like a man who was sleeping with her." Each detail felt like another small knife wound. Arthur hadn't just been deceiving me, he'd been risking his professional reputation by conducting his affair so publicly that colleagues were noticing. I hired a private investigator the next day, a recommendation from the divorce attorney Elaine had helped me find. Detective Mills was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "I need to know how long this has been going on," I told her. "My husband claims it started in June, but I think he's lying about the timeline." "They usually are," Detective Mills said matter-of-factly. "Men who cheat often minimize the duration to seem less culpable." "What's your timeline?" Within a week, Detective Mills had uncovered the truth. Credit card records showed Arthur had been taking Camilla to expensive dinners since early May. Hotel receipts revealed overnight trips together dating back to April. Text message records obtained through legal channels showed intimate communications beginning in March. Arthur hadn't fallen for a colleague over the summer. He'd been pursuing Camilla from almost the moment she joined the project, conducting a full-scale affair for 6 months while maintaining our marriage as his safety net. The man I'd trusted completely had been living a double life for half a year, and I'd been too naive to see it. October arrived like a cruel joke, bringing with it the kind of perfect autumn weather that Arthur and I used to love. The leaves in Central Park turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the air carried that crisp promise of winter, and couples walked hand in hand through our neighborhood wearing matching scarves and satisfied smiles. I watched them from my bedroom window, these happy pairs who seemed to mock my solitude, and felt something inside me finally shatter completely. The private investigator's report sat on my kitchen counter like a piece of evidence from a crime scene. 6 months of deception, documented in receipts and photographs and text message timestamps. Arthur hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been methodically planning his escape while I remained completely oblivious. I stopped showering regularly. What was the point? There was no one to look good for, no dinner parties to host, no husband to impress with my put-together appearance. My hair hung limp and unwashed, my skin broke out from stress and poor nutrition, and I rotated between the same 3 pairs of sweatpants. Work became impossible. I'd sit in client meetings and find myself unable to focus on campaign strategies or brand messaging. How could I help companies sell their stories when I couldn't even recognize the truth about my own life? "Emilia, are you feeling all right?" my boss Margaret asked after I delivered a presentation that was clearly subpar. "You seem distracted lately." Just dealing with some personal issues, I mumbled, avoiding her concerned gaze. Is there anything we can do to help? Maybe you need some time off? Time off! As if a vacation could fix the fact that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. By November, I was eating one meal a day, usually something I could consume without thinking: cereal, crackers, whatever required minimal preparation. The brownstone felt cavernous and haunted, every room echoing with memories of the life I'd thought I was living. I started drinking wine at lunch, telling myself it was just to take the edge off the anxiety that plagued me from the moment I woke up until I finally passed out each night. The wine led to afternoon naps, which led to sleeping until noon, which led to calling in sick more often than I showed up. The worst moments came at night, when the silence of the house amplified every doubt and self-recrimination. I would lie in our king-sized bed, which now felt impossibly vast, and replay every conversation from the past year, looking for clues I'd missed. How had I been so blind? Arthur had been living a double life for 6 months, and I'd never suspected a thing. What did that say about me as a wife, as a woman, as a person who supposedly understood human psychology well enough to craft marketing campaigns that influenced behavior? I stopped answering calls from friends. Elaine left increasingly worried voicemails that I deleted without listening to completely. My parents drove down from New Jersey twice, but I pretended not to be home, hiding in the back bedroom until they gave up knocking. The house began to reflect my internal state. Dishes piled up in the sink, mail accumulated unopened on the kitchen counter, and the plants Arthur had carefully tended started dying from neglect. I couldn't bring myself to care about any of it. The lowest point came on a Tuesday in late November, when I found myself standing in our walk-in closet, surrounded by Arthur's remaining clothes. He'd taken his favorites but left behind shirts and suits that still smelled like his cologne. I pulled one of his sweaters against my chest and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. That's when I called the suicide prevention hotline, not because I had a plan, but because I needed someone to remind me that this pain wouldn't last forever. I feel like I don't exist anymore, I told the gentle-voiced counselor who answered. He took everything, not just our marriage, but my sense of reality. I don't know who I am if I'm not his wife. You're a person who's experiencing profound grief, the counselor replied. Betrayal trauma affects your ability to trust your own perceptions, but you do exist, separate from your marriage, separate from what he did to you. The conversation lasted an hour, and probably saved my life, not from any immediate danger but from the slow dissolution that was eating away at my sense of self. After hanging up, I looked around the bedroom that had become my prison, and made my first real decision in months. I was going to survive this, but I couldn't do it alone. I called Elaine and admitted I was drowning. I made an appointment with a therapist. I hired a cleaning service to deal with the house. I started taking antidepressants that my doctor prescribed after I finally admitted how dark my thoughts had become. Recovery wasn't linear or quick, but it was a beginning. The woman who had once believed she could fix anything with enough planning and determination was learning that sometimes the only way forward was to accept help and acknowledge that being broken wasn't the same as being defeated. Arthur had destroyed the life I thought I was living, but he hadn't destroyed me. That realization would become the foundation for everything that came next. The catalyst for my transformation came from the most unexpected source, a 23-year-old barista named Marcel, who worked at the coffee shop 3 blocks from my brownstone. It was a Tuesday morning in early December, and I was making my first attempt at returning to normal routines after weeks of self-imposed isolation. I'd forced myself to shower, put on clean clothes, and walked to grind coffee for what used to be a simple pleasure, a proper cappuccino made by someone who cared about the foam art. The shop was nearly empty except for a few freelancers typing on laptops and an elderly man reading the newspaper. Marcel was new since my last visit months earlier, and he had the kind of easy confidence that suggested he was working this job by choice rather than necessity. When I approached the counter, he looked up from the espresso machine and smiled with genuine warmth. "What can I get started for you?" he asked, and something about his tone, friendly without being intrusive, made me pause. "Large cappuccino," I said, then added impulsively, "extra dry." "Coming right up. Haven't seen you here before, and I've got a good memory for coffee preferences. I used to come here regularly," I admitted. Marcel nodded as he worked, his movements precise and practiced. Sometimes routines need shaking up. "I'm Marcel, by the way. Moved here from Portland last month." "Amelia," I replied, watching him create perfect microfoam. What brought you to New York? Honestly, heartbreak, Marcel said with a self-deprecating laugh. My girlfriend of 4 years decided she needed to find herself by sleeping with my best friend. Figured if I was going to be miserable, I might as well be miserable somewhere interesting. The casual way he mentioned betrayal made me look at him more carefully. He was tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he'd run his hands through it, brown eyes that held humor despite his admission, and the kind of smile that suggested he'd learned to find lightness even in difficult circumstances. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. That must have been devastating. It was, Marcel agreed, adding the foam to my cappuccino with practiced artistry. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is also the thing that forces you to figure out who you really are. He handed me the coffee, and I was surprised to see he'd created a perfect leaf design in the foam. That's beautiful. Thanks. It's therapeutic, actually. Creating something pretty from something as simple as coffee and milk. Marcel leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. Are you going through your own version of heartbreak? The question was gentle enough that I found myself answering honestly. My husband left me for someone younger. Turns out he'd been lying to me for months. Ah, Marcel said with understanding. The double betrayal. The thing itself plus the realization that you can't trust your own judgment about people. Exactly. I was surprised by how precisely he'd captured the feeling. How did you know that? Because I spent 3 months convinced I was losing my mind, questioning every conversation, every moment of happiness, wondering if any of it had been real. Marcel straightened up as another customer entered. But here's what I figured out. Their lies don't say anything about us. They say everything about them. That simple statement hit me with unexpected force. For months I'd been torturing myself with questions about what I'd done wrong, what I'd missed, how I'd failed as a wife. Marcel was suggesting that Arthur's deception was about Arthur, not about me. Can I ask you something? I said impulsively as Marcel prepared to help the new customer. Sure. How do you get past the anger, not just at them but at yourself for not seeing it coming? Marcel considered this seriously. I started channeling it into something productive, learned to make coffee that's actually good instead of the garbage I used to serve in Portland, picked up photography, started rock climbing. He grinned. Turns out rage is excellent fuel when you direct it properly. I left the coffee shop that morning with more than just caffeine in my system. Marcel's perspective had shifted something fundamental in my thinking. Instead of seeing my situation as evidence of my failure, I could view it as an opportunity to discover what I was capable of when I stopped trying to be the perfect wife. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to grind coffee regularly. Marcel and I developed an easy friendship built on shared understanding of betrayal and recovery. He told me about his photography projects documenting urban architecture, his weekend rock climbing adventures, his plans to eventually open his own coffee roasting business. You should try something completely new, he suggested one morning while making my usual cappuccino, something you never would have done while you were married. Like what? I don't know. What did you want to do before you got caught up in being half of a couple? The question stayed with me for days. What had I wanted before Arthur? What dreams had I shelved in favor of building our perfect partnership? The answer, when it came to me, was surprising in its simplicity. I'd always wanted to travel alone, to experience places without compromise or negotiation, to make decisions based purely on my own desires. For the first time in months, I had something to look forward to. The decision to travel alone felt like stepping off a cliff, but it was the first choice I'd made in months that belonged entirely to me. I booked a week in Barcelona for February, telling no one except my therapist and Elaine, who immediately offered to help me plan the itinerary. You don't need help planning, she said when I started to accept her offer. That's the whole point, isn't it? Making decisions without consulting anyone? She was right. For 8 years, every decision had been filtered through Arthur's preferences, our joint schedule, our shared aesthetic. Now I could choose a hotel based purely on my own taste, visit museums that interested me, eat at restaurants I found appealing. The weeks leading up to the trip became a project in rediscovering myself. I cleaned out my closet, donating clothes that Arthur had complimented and keeping pieces that made me feel confident. I signed up for Spanish lessons at the community center, spending Tuesday evenings learning to conjugate verbs with a group of other adults who were embracing new challenges. Marcel celebrated each small step in my recovery with genuine enthusiasm. When I told him about the Spanish classes, he insisted on practicing conversation with me during my morning coffee visits. ¿Cómo te sientes hoy? He'd ask while preparing my cappuccino. Me siento optimista, I'd reply, surprised to realize it was true. Dr. Patricia Chen, my therapist, helped me understand that recovery from betrayal trauma wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and independent. Other days I missed Arthur so intensely I could barely function. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, Dr. Chen explained during one of our weekly sessions. It means integrating the experience into your life story without letting it define your entire narrative. She introduced me to EMDR therapy to help process the trauma of discovery and abandonment. The sessions were exhausting but effective, helping me separate the actual events from the emotional charge they carried. Your nervous system has been in hypervigilance mode for months, Dr. Chen explained. We need to teach your body that the threat is over, that you're safe to trust your own perceptions again. The physical symptoms of trauma had been as debilitating as the emotional ones. I'd been experiencing panic attacks, insomnia, and a constant state of anxious alertness that left me exhausted. Slowly, through therapy and medication adjustments, my body began to remember how to relax. I started going to yoga classes at a studio near my office, initially just to have something structured to do with my evenings. The instructor, a serene woman named Susan, seemed to sense that several of us were there for healing rather than fitness. Breathe into the places that hurt, she'd say during particularly challenging poses. Sometimes we have to stretch around our pain before we can move through it. The other students and I rarely spoke, but there was something comforting about sharing space with people who were also working to rebuild themselves from the inside out. January brought an unexpected breakthrough when I received a wedding invitation from my college friend Jennifer. My first instinct was to decline. The thought of watching another couple exchange vows felt like torture. But Dr. Chen encouraged me to consider why the idea felt threatening. "What specifically about weddings feels dangerous to you now?" she asked. "I don't want to be reminded of how naive I was," I admitted. "How completely I believed in something that turned out to be a lie." "But their wedding isn't about your marriage," Dr. Chen pointed out. "Their promises don't diminish the fact that you kept yours. Your integrity remains intact regardless of Arthur's choices." I decided to attend the wedding, partly as an act of defiance against the fear that had been controlling too many of my decisions. I bought a new dress, emerald green silk, that made me feel elegant rather than trying to please anyone else. I went alone, which felt both terrifying and liberating. Watching Jennifer and her fiancé exchange vows, I realized something unexpected. My marriage to Arthur had been real for me, even if it hadn't been real for him. My love, my commitment, my vision of our future, those had been authentic. Arthur's deception didn't retroactively invalidate my experience. During the reception, I found myself actually enjoying conversations with other guests. A couple asked about Arthur, and I was able to say simply, "We're divorced," without feeling the need to explain or justify. "I'm sorry," the woman replied with genuine sympathy. "Thank you," I said, "but I'm doing well." And for the first time, I meant it. The trip to Barcelona was still 3 weeks away, but I was already feeling like someone who could handle traveling alone, eating dinner at restaurants without feeling self-conscious, navigating foreign cities with confidence. Marcel noticed the change when I returned to the coffee shop the Monday after the wedding. "You look different," he observed while making my cappuccino. "Lighter somehow." "I went to a wedding this weekend," I told him, "and it didn't destroy me." "That's huge," Marcel said, adding his signature leaf design to my foam. "You're becoming someone who can hold joy and sadness at the same time. That's actually a superpower." I was beginning to think he might be right. Barcelona changed everything. 5 days of wandering through Gothic quarters and modernist architecture, eating tapas at tiny bars where I practiced my Spanish with patient locals, sitting in Park Güell watching the sunset paint the city gold. It was the first time in almost a year that I felt truly present in my own life. On my last evening, I was having dinner alone at a seafood restaurant near the beach when a man at the neighboring table struck up a conversation. He was American, in Barcelona for a photography exhibition, and when he learned I was traveling solo, his expression shifted to something like admiration. "That takes courage," he said. "Most people are terrified of their own company." "I'm learning to enjoy it," I replied, surprising myself with how true that statement was. We talked for an hour about travel, art, and the strange freedom that comes from making decisions based purely on personal preference. When he asked for my number, I politely declined, but not because I was afraid or unready. I simply wasn't interested, and recognizing my own lack of interest felt like a victory. I returned to New York with a confidence I hadn't possessed since before Arthur's betrayal. Marcel noticed immediately when I stopped by Grind Coffee my first morning back. "Spain agreed with you," he observed, studying my face as he prepared my cappuccino. "You look like someone who knows something she didn't know before." "I learned I can trust myself again," I said, "my instincts, my judgment, my ability to navigate the world alone." "That's everything," Marcel replied, handing me my coffee with a smile that seemed particularly warm. "Most people never figure that out." Something had shifted between us during my absence, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Marcel's usual friendly professionalism contained a new note of personal interest, and I found myself looking forward to our morning conversations with an anticipation that went beyond caffeine dependency. The change became obvious the following week when Marcel asked if I'd like to see his photography exhibition at a gallery in Williamsburg. The invitation was casual enough to maintain plausible deniability, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this was more than friendship. "I'd love to," I heard myself say, then added quickly, "as friends." Marcel's grin was understanding rather than disappointed. "As friends," he agreed, "for now." The exhibition was stunning, urban landscapes that captured the hidden beauty in ordinary moments. Marcel had photographed construction workers framed against sunrise, elderly women feeding pigeons in ways that looked like choreographed dance, children playing in fire hydrant spray that sparkled like diamonds. "You see things differently," I told him as we stood before a photograph of scaffolding that he'd somehow made look like abstract sculpture. "I see things as they actually are," Marcel corrected. "Most people are too busy rushing toward the next thing to notice what's right in front of them." We went for dinner afterward, ostensibly to discuss the exhibition but actually to continue the conversation we'd been having in fragments for months. Marcel told me about his ex-girlfriend Camilla. The name made me wince, who had been a successful marketing executive in Portland before deciding she needed adventure with his best friend. "Wait," I said, my fork pausing midair. "Your ex was named Camilla." "Yeah, why?" "Arthur's girlfriend is also named Camilla. She's an architect." Marcel's expression shifted to something between amusement and disbelief. "You're kidding. Camilla Walsh, 26, blonde MIT graduate. Camilla Harper, 25, brunette marketing executive." Marcel leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "What are the odds?" "Maybe it's a cursed name," I suggested, and we both started laughing. The shared experience of betrayal by women with the same name became a running joke between us, but it also created a deeper bond. We understood each other's specific brand of hurt, in ways that other people couldn't. Over the following weeks, Marcel and I began spending time together outside of my morning coffee visits. We went to museums, tried new restaurants, attended photography exhibitions and art openings. Everything was carefully framed as friendship, but the undercurrent of attraction was impossible to ignore. "I'm not ready for anything serious," I told him one evening as we walked through Central Park after seeing a film at Lincoln Center. "I'm not asking for serious," Marcel replied. "I'm asking for honest, and honestly, I think we're good for each other." He was right. Marcel's presence in my life felt healing rather than complicated. He didn't try to fix me or rush my recovery. He simply offered companionship and perspective from someone who understood what it felt like to have your reality shattered by someone you trusted. When Marcel finally kissed me in early April, outside my brownstone after an evening at a gallery opening, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Not desperate or rebound-driven, but like a genuine connection between two people who had found each other after learning to be complete on their own. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Marcel admitted, his forehead resting against mine. "I know," I said, smiling. "I've been wanting you to want to." For the first time in over a year, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. By summer, Marcel and I had settled into a relationship that felt both passionate and stable, a combination I hadn't known was possible. Unlike my marriage to Arthur, which had been built on shared ambitions and careful planning, what Marcel and I had developed organically from friendship, mutual respect, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal. Marcel had given up his apartment in Brooklyn and moved into my brownstone in June, not because we were rushing toward traditional milestones, but because it made practical and emotional sense. He transformed Arthur's former home office into a darkroom for his photography, and I converted the third floor, originally planned as a nursery, into a studio space where I could work on freelance projects. "This house feels alive again," Marcel observed one Sunday morning as we sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. "When I first visited, it felt like a museum to someone else's life." He was right. The brownstone had become ours rather than mine by default. Marcel's photographs lined the hallways alongside pieces we'd chosen together. His books mixed with mine on the shelves. His laughter filled rooms that had been silent for too long. I'd left Morrison & Associates in April to start my own consulting firm, specializing in crisis communication and brand recovery skills I'd developed through personal experience. My first major client was a tech startup whose founder had been caught in a scandal similar to Arthur's situation. Helping them rebuild their reputation felt like a form of therapy. "You're different when you talk about work now," Marcel noted after I'd successfully completed a campaign that restored public trust in a company everyone had written off. "You sound like someone who found her calling, rather than someone who's just good at her job." The business grew quickly, partly because I understood the psychology of rebuilding in ways that academic training couldn't teach. Clients appreciated working with someone who had navigated public humiliation and emerged stronger. Marcel's photography career was flourishing as well. His exhibition about urban resilience had caught the attention of several galleries, and he'd been commissioned to document gentrification patterns across Brooklyn for a major magazine spread. "We're both building careers from our damage," he said one evening as we reviewed his latest photographs. "There's something beautiful about that." Our relationship had its own rhythm, different from anything I'd experienced with Arthur. Marcel and I maintained separate friend groups and individual interests while building shared experiences. He didn't try to become my entire world, and I didn't expect him to fill every emotional need. "I love that you're complete without me," Marcel told me one night as we lay in bed after hosting a dinner party for his photographer friends. "Arthur sounds like he needed you to validate his choices. I just want to share experiences with someone I admire." The contrast was stark. Arthur had required my constant affirmation and support for his vision of our perfect life. Marcel celebrated my independence and encouraged me to pursue goals that had nothing to do with our relationship. In August, I received an unexpected call that would test everything we'd built together. Margaret from Morrison & Associates called to tell me that Arthur's firm was facing a major scandal. "The Morrison Tower project has been shut down," Margaret explained. "Apparently there were significant building code violations and environmental safety issues that were covered up during the approval process." The story broke in the architecture trade publications first, then spread to mainstream media. Arthur's firm was being investigated for fraud, and several employees, including Arthur himself, were facing potential criminal charges. "The environmental consultant who worked on the project has been cooperating with investigators," Margaret continued. She claims Arthur pressured her to falsify sustainability reports. Camilla, Arthur's golden girl, had turned state's evidence against him. I felt a complex mix of emotions reading the news coverage. Part of me experienced satisfaction at seeing Arthur face consequences for his deception, but mostly I felt relief that I'd escaped before his professional misconduct could destroy my reputation along with his. "How are you processing this?" Marcel asked that evening, reading the articles I'd shown him. "I keep thinking about what my life would look like right now if Arthur hadn't left," I admitted. "I'd probably be standing by him through this scandal, sacrificing my career to support his defense. Instead, you're building something that's entirely yours," Marcel pointed out. "Something he can't touch or taint or take credit for." The scandal grew worse over the following weeks. Photos emerged of Arthur and Camilla at expensive restaurants, charged to the Morrison Tower project as client entertainment. Their affair had been funded by fraudulent billing practices that were now part of the federal investigation. "She really saved you," Marcel observed, reading about the latest developments. "If Camilla hadn't lured Arthur away, you might have been implicated in all of this." It was true. Arthur's betrayal, which had felt like the end of my world, had actually been my salvation. While I'd been building a new life based on authenticity and personal strength, Arthur had been constructing a house of cards that was now collapsing spectacularly. For the first time, I felt genuinely grateful that my marriage had ended when it did. The call came on a crisp October morning, while Marcel and I were planning our first vacation together, a photography trip to Iceland that represented everything healthy about our relationship. Unlike my carefully orchestrated travels with Arthur, this would be an adventure guided by spontaneity and shared curiosity rather than rigid itineraries. "Emilia, this is Detective Mills." I recognized the voice of the private investigator I'd hired almost a year earlier to uncover the truth about Arthur's affair. I'd assumed our business was finished once the divorce was finalized, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I hope you don't mind me calling," Detective Mills continued. "I've been following the Morrison Tower scandal in the news, and something came to my attention that I thought you should know." Marcel looked up from his laptop where he'd been researching Icelandic landscapes, sensing the shift in my energy. "What kind of something?" I asked, stepping into the kitchen for privacy. "I've been in contact with federal investigators working the fraud case. During their investigation of Arthur's financial records, they discovered some interesting patterns that go back further than the Morrison Tower project." My stomach tightened with familiar dread. Even now, months after our divorce was finalized, Arthur still had the power to complicate my life. The investigators found evidence that Arthur had been embezzling from his own firm for over 2 years, Detective Mills explained. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums. The money was being funneled into personal accounts and used to fund an expensive lifestyle that his business income couldn't support. What does this have to do with me? The timeline, Amelia. The embezzlement began in earnest around the time of your 5th wedding anniversary. The expensive restaurants, the luxury trips, the designer clothes, Arthur was stealing from his business partners to maintain the image of success he wanted to project. I sank into one of our kitchen chairs, processing this information. Our perfect anniversary party, the celebration of everything we'd accomplished together, had been funded by stolen money. "There's more," Detective Mills continued. "The investigators also discovered that Arthur had been planning his exit strategy for much longer than anyone realized. He'd been gradually moving assets into accounts that Camilla had access to, preparing to disappear with both the money and his young girlfriend." "Are you saying he was planning to leave me even before the affair started?" "I'm saying Arthur was planning to leave everyone. You, his business partners, his financial obligations. Camilla wasn't the catalyst for his departure. She was part of his escape plan." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd believed about the timeline of Arthur's betrayal was wrong. He hadn't fallen for a colleague and impulsively destroyed our marriage. He'd been systematically planning his exit while maintaining the facade of our perfect partnership. Marcel appeared in the kitchen doorway, concern evident in his expression. I held up a finger, indicating I needed another moment. "Detective Mills, how long do you think Arthur was planning this?" "Based on the financial patterns and digital forensics, I'd estimate he started planning his departure at least 18 months before he actually left, possibly longer." 18 months. While I'd been planning our future children and discussing long-term business strategies, Arthur had been orchestrating his disappearance. "The federal investigators wanted me to ask if you'd noticed any unusual financial activity during your marriage. Large cash withdrawals, unexplained credit card charges, new accounts you weren't aware of." I thought back to the months before Arthur left, remembering details that had seemed insignificant at the time. He did start handling more of our finances personally, said it was more efficient than both of us managing different accounts. That would fit the pattern. Arthur was likely moving money to protect it from asset division during the divorce he was already planning. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence while Marcel made me tea and waited patiently for me to explain what had happened. "Arthur wasn't just unfaithful," I finally said. "He was a criminal, and he'd been planning to abandon me for years." Marcel's jaw tightened with anger, but his voice remained gentle. "How do you feel about learning this?" It was a good question. I'd expected to feel devastated by another layer of betrayal, but instead I felt something unexpected: relief. "Free," I said, surprising myself. "I feel free." For months I've been torturing myself with questions about what I could have done differently, how I could have been a better wife, whether our marriage could have been saved if I'd been more attentive to Arthur's needs. I looked at Marcel, seeing understanding in his eyes. "But you can't save someone who's been planning to leave you for years. You can't be a better partner to someone who's actively stealing from you." Marcel reached across the table and took my hand. "Arthur's deception was never about you being inadequate. It was about him being fundamentally dishonest." That evening, I called Dr. Chen to process this new information. Her perspective was similar to Marcel's, but with clinical precision. "This revelation actually supports your healing," she explained. "It confirms that Arthur's behavior was pathological rather than reactive. You couldn't have prevented something that was years in the making." For the first time since Arthur left, I felt completely absolved of responsibility for my marriage's failure. The truth had finally set me free. The letter arrived on a Thursday in November, delivered by certified mail while Marcel was teaching a photography workshop and I was working from home on a client campaign. The return address made my stomach drop. Arthur Thompson, followed by what I recognized as the address of a federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, revealing Arthur's familiar handwriting on standard prison stationery. "Amelia," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, but I'm facing sentencing next month, and there are things I need to say before it's too late." I set the letter down immediately, my heart pounding with a familiar anxiety I hadn't experienced in months. After everything Detective Mills had revealed about Arthur's systematic deception, I'd finally achieved peace with our divorce. Now he was reaching out from federal prison, threatening to disrupt the equilibrium I'd worked so hard to build. Marcel found me sitting in our kitchen an hour later, the unopened letter still on the table between my coffee cup and laptop. "You don't have to read it," he said simply, recognizing Arthur's handwriting. "You don't owe him your attention just because he's decided he has something to say." But what if there's something important? What if he's finally ready to tell the truth about what really happened? Marcel sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. What truth could he possibly offer that would change anything about your life now? It was a fair question. I had my career, my relationship with Marcel, my independence and my peace of mind. What could Arthur's prison confessions possibly add to my understanding that would improve my current situation? But curiosity won out over wisdom. That evening, after Marcel went to his dark room to develop photographs from a recent assignment, I opened Arthur's letter. "The federal prosecutors are recommending a 7-year sentence," Arthur wrote. "John and I will likely lose everything. The business, our homes, our professional reputations. Camilla has been cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity, providing them with evidence about financial irregularities she claims I pressured her to ignore. Even from prison, Arthur was painting himself as a victim of Camilla's manipulation rather than taking responsibility for his choices. I need you to know that none of this was supposed to involve you. I spent years trying to figure out how to leave our marriage without destroying you financially. The embezzlement was meant to protect you, to ensure you'd get the brownstone and enough assets to maintain your lifestyle after I was gone." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of this justification. Arthur was claiming he'd stolen money to protect me from the financial consequences of his planned abandonment. "Camilla convinced me that we could start fresh in Europe once the Morrison Tower project was completed. She had connections with architectural firms in Amsterdam and Barcelona that were interested in hiring American designers with sustainable building expertise. The plan was to complete the project, transfer the necessary funds, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened." The letter continued for 3 more pages, detailing Arthur's elaborate plans for international escape and his portrayal of Camilla as the mastermind behind their failed scheme. According to Arthur, he'd been a reluctant participant in criminal activity, motivated by love and manipulated by a younger woman who understood financial systems better than he did. "I know you'll probably never forgive me," the letter concluded, "but I wanted you to understand that my feelings for you were real, even if my actions were inexcusable. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I hope you found the happiness that I was too selfish and weak to provide." The letter was signed simply Arthur, without the endearments that had once concluded his communications to me. I read it twice, waiting for some emotional response: anger, sadness, closure, vindication. Instead, I felt a strange kind of emptiness, as if Arthur's words were reaching me from such a great distance that they'd lost all power to affect my emotional state. Marcel emerged from his dark room around 10 o'clock, chemical smells clinging to his clothes, and found me sitting in our living room with Arthur's letter folded on the coffee table. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling beside me on the couch we'd chosen together. "Like I'm reading about someone else's life," I admitted. "The woman Arthur is writing to, the one who might care about his explanations and justifications. She doesn't exist anymore." "That's growth," Marcel said, pulling me against his side. "The fact that his words don't have power over you anymore." Should I write back? Should I visit him before sentencing? Marcel was quiet for a moment, considering. "What would you hope to accomplish?" I thought about this seriously. What did I want from Arthur at this point? An apology? An admission of guilt? Closure? Nothing, I realized. There's literally nothing he could say that would change anything about my life now. "Then you have your answer." I folded Arthur's letter and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents. Not because I wanted to preserve it, but because someday I might need evidence of his final attempt to rewrite history. The man who had once been the center of my universe was now just a voice from the past, powerless to disrupt the future I was building. The full scope of Arthur's deception revealed itself during his sentencing hearing in December, which I attended not out of lingering attachment, but because I needed to witness the final chapter of the story that had once defined my life. Marcel offered to accompany me, but I knew this was something I had to face alone. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was imposing and cold, filled with lawyers, defendants, and family members, navigating the bureaucracy of justice. I sat in the back row of the gallery, watching Arthur enter the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and more fragile than I remembered. His parents were there, his mother Karen looking aged and devastated. John, his former business partner, sat with his own legal team, having negotiated a more favorable plea deal in exchange for testimony against Arthur. Camilla was notably absent, having already completed her cooperation with prosecutors and moved on to whatever life awaited her after betraying yet another man who'd trusted her. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out a timeline of fraud that was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. Arthur hadn't just been stealing money for the past 2 years. He'd been systematically defrauding clients, business partners, and government agencies for over 4 years. Essentially throughout the entire period I'd believed we were building our successful life together. Mr. Thompson used his reputation and personal relationships to gain the trust of clients, then deliberately inflated project costs, billed for non-existent services, and falsified environmental compliance reports, the prosecutor explained to the judge. He used stolen funds to maintain a lifestyle that served as marketing for his fraud, appearing successful enough to attract more victims. Our anniversary party, our expensive dinners, the designer clothes and luxury vacations I'd thought represented our professional success, all of it had been funded by stolen money, used as props in Arthur's elaborate performance of prosperity. The victim impact statements were the most revealing part of the proceedings. An elderly couple who'd hired Arthur to design their retirement home spoke about losing their life savings when his firm's environmental violations forced them to demolish and rebuild their entire structure. A small nonprofit organization described how Arthur's inflated billing had nearly bankrupted their affordable housing project. Mr. Thompson didn't just steal money, one victim explained to the judge. He stole our trust in the professional relationships that are supposed to protect clients from exactly this kind of exploitation. When Arthur's defense attorney spoke, he painted a picture of a man who'd been overwhelmed by financial pressure and manipulated by a younger woman who understood the business better than he did. According to this narrative, Arthur was primarily guilty of weakness and poor judgment rather than criminal intent. My client fell under the influence of Camilla Walsh, who convinced him that these financial irregularities were standard practice in the industry, the defense attorney argued. Mr. Thompson was naive about business operations and trusted someone who exploited his inexperience for her own benefit. I almost laughed at this portrayal of Arthur as an innocent victim of Camilla's manipulation. The man I'd been married to had been calculating and ambitious, capable of complex strategic thinking and long-term planning. The idea that he'd been a passive participant in criminal activity contradicted everything I knew about his personality. The most shocking revelation came during Camilla's deposition, which was read aloud as part of the prosecution's evidence. In her statement, she described how Arthur had specifically recruited her for the Morrison Tower project, not because of her environmental expertise, but because he needed someone young and ambitious enough to falsify compliance reports without asking too many questions. Mr. Thompson told me that environmental regulations were bureaucratic obstacles that prevented innovative architecture. Camilla's statement read. He said successful architects learned to work around these limitations creatively. He framed the falsified reports as industry standard practices that older, more conservative firms were too rigid to embrace. According to Camilla's testimony, Arthur had seduced her professionally before pursuing her romantically, using their shared criminal activity as a bonding experience that isolated her from potential whistleblowers. He told me that our relationship, both professional and personal, was proof that we were partners in building something revolutionary in sustainable architecture. The fraud was presented as innovation, and our affair was presented as a natural extension of our professional collaboration. The timeline Camilla provided showed that Arthur had been planning to abandon both his marriage and his business from the moment he'd hired her. Their relationship hadn't evolved naturally from professional collaboration. It had been orchestrated as part of Arthur's exit strategy. Mr. Thompson informed me that he planned to divorce his wife once our project was completed and we'd established ourselves in European markets. Camilla's statement continued. He said his marriage had been a professional necessity during the early years of his career, but that he was now successful enough to prioritize personal happiness over strategic partnerships. Hearing my marriage described as a strategic partnership that Arthur had outgrown felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for over a year. I hadn't failed as a wife. I'd simply served my purpose in Arthur's long-term plan and become expendable once he'd achieved the success my support had helped him build. When the judge sentenced Arthur to 8 years in federal prison, I felt nothing resembling satisfaction or vindication, just a profound sense of closure, as if a book I'd been forced to read had finally reached its conclusion. The man I'd loved had never really existed. I'd been married to a performance, a carefully constructed character designed to achieve specific goals before disappearing into whatever came next. The idea came to me 3 months after Arthur's sentencing, during a conversation with Marcel about our upcoming second anniversary together. We were planning a quiet celebration dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first official date, followed by a photography walk through the neighborhoods where our relationship had developed. "I want to do something that officially closes the Arthur chapter," I told Marcel as we reviewed potential restaurant reservations, "something that transforms the last piece of that experience into something positive." Marcel looked up from his laptop, curious. "What did you have in mind?" "A wedding." The word hung in the air between us, carrying weight I hadn't expected. Marcel and I had talked about marriage in abstract terms, the way couples do when they're building something solid but not rushing toward traditional milestones. But suddenly the idea felt urgent and necessary. "A wedding," Marcel repeated slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not because we need to prove anything, or because I'm trying to replace what I had with Arthur," I clarified quickly, "because I want to celebrate what we've built together, because I want to invite everyone who matters to us and show them what real partnership looks like." Marcel closed his laptop and gave me his full attention. "Are you proposing to me, Amelia Rodriguez?" I realized that's exactly what I was doing. "I think I am. Will you marry me, Marcel Santos?" His smile started slowly, then spread across his face like sunrise. "Only if we can have the kind of wedding that would make Arthur absolutely furious." "What kind of wedding would that be?" "Authentic, joyful, completely focused on celebrating us instead of impressing other people." We planned the wedding for October, exactly 2 years after Arthur's letter from prison, and just over 3 years since he'd left me. The venue was the rooftop garden of the museum where Marcel had first exhibited his photography, the same space where we'd had our first real conversation about art and resilience. The guest list was small but meaningful. Our families, close friends who'd supported us through our individual recoveries, colleagues who respected our work, and the community we'd built together. Marcel's photography students, my clients who'd become friends. The baristas from Grind Coffee who'd witnessed the evolution of our relationship over morning cappuccinos. Instead of traditional wedding roles, we asked friends to contribute in ways that reflected their relationships with us. Elaine officiated the ceremony after getting ordained online. Dr. Chen read a poem about healing and growth. Marcel's mentor from photography school documented the day. My new business partner designed invitations that looked like vintage postcards from our travels. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in our brownstone, the same house where Arthur had packed his bags and abandoned our marriage, now transformed into a home that reflected our shared aesthetic and values. Marcel's photographs lined the hallway, interspersed with art we'd collected together and mementos from adventures we'd shared. "No regrets?" Marcel asked as we had coffee in our kitchen before heading to our separate preparation locations. "None," I said, meaning it completely. Arthur leaving was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though I didn't know it at the time. The ceremony was everything Arthur would have hated. Intimate instead of impressive, focused on substance rather than spectacle, celebrating a relationship built on mutual respect rather than strategic partnership. Marcel and I exchanged vows we'd written separately but that somehow complemented each other perfectly. "Amelia taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting," Marcel said, his voice steady as he looked into my eyes. "It means integrating our experiences into something stronger and more beautiful than what came before. I promise to keep growing with you, to remain curious about who you're becoming, and to never take for granted the gift of being chosen by someone who could be complete without me." My vows were shorter but equally honest. "Marcel, you showed me the difference between being needed and being wanted, between building a life with someone and building a performance for other people. I promise to keep choosing you, to support your dreams without losing myself in them, and to remember that the best relationships are between two people who make each other braver. The reception was a celebration of survival and transformation. Instead of formal toasts, we invited guests to share stories about resilience, creativity, and second chances. Instead of a traditional first dance, Marcel and I walked through the crowd together, stopping to have real conversations with everyone who'd come to celebrate with us. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing at the edge of the rooftop garden, looking out over the Manhattan skyline that had been the backdrop for both my greatest heartbreak and my most profound healing. Marcel appeared beside me, loosening his tie after hours of celebration. "Any final thoughts on your wedding day?" he asked. I considered his question seriously. 3 years ago, I'd believed my life was over when Arthur left. I'd thought happiness was something that happened to you rather than something you created through your own choices and growth. "I'm grateful," I said finally, "for all of it, even the pain, because it taught me what I was actually capable of surviving and building." Marcel pulled me close as the city lights twinkled below us like stars. "Here's to building something that lasts," he said. "Here's to building something real," I replied, and for the first time in my adult life, I knew exactly what that meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.